I saw the movie before I read the graphic novel, so I'll be comparing them a bit. I love the movie, and after reading the graphic novels, I love that too. Now, they aren't all called Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. There's 6 graphic novels, and each is called its own thing. Like, one is called Scott's Precious Little Life, and one is, as previously mentioned, Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. Now, they all tie into each other, and it's important to read them in order, and honestly, a box set with all of them isn't that pricey as of writing this. Comic-wise, I was blown away how close the comic and movie is. Some things are basically the same shot, and some things are basically word for word the same. And I can't read this without hearing the actors' voices. Scott is Michael Cera, Julie is Audrey Plaza, etc. In my head, I hear the voices as I read the characters. For those who don't know, the story follows Scott Pilgrim, who is a 20-something-year-old douchebag who's dating a 17-year-old rebound, but then he meets a woman who he actually wants to date, Ramona Flowers, who, in order to date, he must defeat her 7 evil exes. It's mainly a comedy drama story with many video game and musical elements tacked in, and I think it's really well done. The story also takes place in Canada, which is why nobody's freaking out that Knifes is 17, because over there, that isn't underage. They are more so kind of like, really dude, what the fuck are you doing? Now as an American reading this, it feels pretty fucking gross because that's underage here, and the idea of an adult dating a high schooler will always be gross to me. But that doesn't make this a bad story. All it means is we have a problematic protagonist, and it's not like it glorifies his actions. It's okay to have flawed characters. It's even important to have flawed characters. And not only is everyone in this story flawed, but I think most of them are well written enough to make the story entertaining. Now, it's not all one-to-one, there are many differences. Some little ones include Scott not saying the Pac-Man thing and instead talking about Ramona's shoes, or my favorite scene of Scott jumping out the window so Knifes doesn't see him is also not here, instead it's just Wallace saying to leave. There's also a bunch of tiny tidbits, like more time spent in Scott's house and Ramona actually tries to meet and get along with Scott's exes. And there's just a lot more backstory scenes and scenes that weren't in the film, which makes sense because I feel like most of what they cut makes sense. It's only a film, so they can only put in so much. And what they cut, I feel like makes sense. Some subplots not included in the film are Scott moving to Ramona's place, lots of parties for characters to interact with each other at, Scott gets a job eventually, Wallace and Scott meet with the landlord, and there's just plenty of others. These, in my opinion, add a lot to the comic, and I really like them. However, again, I understand cutting them for the film. Also, the comic's pretty funny. While a ton of lines from the film were here, there are also funny lines I haven't seen before. Knifes throws a knife while running away from a fight with Ramona, and the note attached to it reads, "You're ugly and I hate you." And I don't know why, but this made me chuckle so hard. There are multiple times I actually laughed in this comic, which is not a usual thing. Now, the band Sex Bomb is still here, and one thing that's cool is you can kind of play along with the song. Probably. I don't know shit about music, but it looks like you can. They also went through many changes, like they used to be the band Sonic and Knuckles, which I love the name of. Then for a good chunk of comic, they are just recording and not playing shows. And then they become Shatterband. Now, I do gotta mention, I love the music of the film. It wasn't even a genre that I would go to, but it was amazing. But as a comic, it obviously loses that audio quality because, you know, there is no audio. And on top of that, the final song of the comic I feel like doesn't fit the way the movie has made me picture the band's music. Because they do a bad cover of I'm a Believer, which I feel like fits Shrek far better than Scott Pilgrim, and I honestly kinda hate it here. Knife gets a lot more time to shine here, and is extra stalkery. At one point, Scott walks out of his house, and Knifes is there, and she's like, "I'm not even stalking you!" It cracked me up. Knifes' dad who is not in the film, is a character here, and he attacks Scott until he gains respect for him and decides he can date Knives. Which again, I know I'm American, so it's different here, but it feels weird and gross to me. Fortunately though, Knives gets over Scott in the comic and realizes what a shit Scott is, and even turns down his advances at one point. I really like this ending for her, of having matured to realize Scott is a piece of shit and she was being used. Ramona is basically the same as in the film, from the hair color changing to the subspace highways. She just has more time here to flesh out personality than she did in the film, and I really don't know what she sees in Scott or what anyone sees in Scott, but I like her character and I think she's neat. Kim being Scott's ex was only briefly mentioned in the film, but here we get a lot more fleshed out of it. We get Scott moving away from her and not keeping contact with her, and that's how they broke up. And we also see that Kim's living situation is often less than ideal. I just really like Kim. I think she's cool, except for one part where she drunkenly makes out with Knives, which is not cool. Then we got Lisa Miller. She was cut from the film entirely, which I think makes a lot of sense, but I do like her character. She was a high school friend of Scott and obviously had a crush on him, but he was an oblivious dweeb who had a crush on Kim. She comes back into Scott's life at a time where Ramona and Scott are going through a rough patch, and she serves to be the drama between them. And hell, Ramona even tries to be cool and friendly towards her, and Scott is a bit too friendly and flirtatious. Now physically he does not cheat, but he puts himself in situations where he could do so, and it's not like we trust him to turn her down, but he actually does, and I was shocked. Not only did Scott turn down Lisa because she was drunk, but also he turned her down because he was still with Ramona. So Scott stopped cheating? Is this character growth? Sadly, he's still shitty in other ways, but at least that was something. Next we got Envy Adams. And with all these exes, why doesn't Scott have his own band of evil exes? But no, this is actually the last one. She was amazing in the film, and amazing here too. She's always the best dressed, coolest one around. We not only get a little more backstory of her when her and Scott were dating, but the comic keeps her around after the Todd fight, and she shows up in multiple scenes and concerts. Also, Ramona has a lot more fighting to do here too. Her and Knife square off, and so do her and Envy. And normally I would bitch about how I hate that they make only the women fight only the women and only the men fight only the men. In this case, I think it makes sense, because Ramona is fighting Scott's exes, which are women, and Scott's fighting her exes, which are mostly men. Also, it's Envy who has the weird underneath thing in the comic and not Ramona's ex. But let's dive into those exes. Almost all of them are the same as in the film. So much so it's pretty fucking crazy. Matthew Patel has the same lines, and even the demon hipster chicks. Biggest difference is Scott's band sings too. Lucas Lee is literally the same, except for the fight goes different, but he still dies skating. Todd is still the same with some of the same lines, and he's still dating Envy. Biggest difference is he's not only purposely cheating on being a vegan, but he's also cheating on Envy too. And in the end, he loses to the vegan police just like in the film. Roxanne is basically the same, with a bit more screen time in this really cool death panel. Now the twins are quite a bit different here, as they attack Scott with robot after robot before fighting him head on. And even then they kidnap Kim to get Scott to come, and there they try to convince Scott Ramona is bad and tell him about how she was cheating on them with each other, and that she's a hypocrite who will also be mad at Scott for cheating, but she also cheats too. And the twins actually kinda got a point, but Scott still beats them up and saves Kim. Once again though, I understand why some of this was cut for movie time's sake. As for Gideon, he not only is having a thing with Envy, but he also has multiple women frozen to be his lovers. His fight against Scott is a lot more multi-layered. My favorite part is when he tells Scott to join him in ruling Ramona's love life, which in itself is funny enough, but when Scott says no, he's like, "Alright, Holmes," and then kills him, and it's funny as shit. Now, like I said, It's big and multi-layered. There are fights in subspace, fights out of subspace. Scott comes back to life thanks to an extra life. Him and Ramona kill Gideon, and instead of a Sex Bob-omb concert going on, it's actually Envy singing while the women are freed from the ice. Now, while these are very similar, I do think all these extra scenes add to the story. In the comic, Scott is an even bigger dick than he is in the movie. He's a cheater. He starts childish arguments. He fetishizes lesbians. Everyone is always taking care of him, but he never gives anything back. He's inconsiderate. He's kind of a predator. And when him and Ramona break up, he immediately starts looking for sex with all his exes. Sure, Wallace recommended he get over Ramona and find sex, but I don't think he was recommending desperately throwing himself at his exes. Fortunately, Knives turns him down, which is super mature of her and great character growth. Envy turns him down, good on her. And Scott kisses Kim and she pushes him away and she's like, "No, Scott, you were shitty to me." Hell, throughout the comic, everyone is warning people about Scott's shitty behavior. Even Scott knows he's not the best, as when Ramona says, "You're the nicest guy I've ever dated," he's like, "Well, that's kinda sad." One of my favorite lines comes from Kim, where she says, "Scott, I'm sad I'm about to die, but I'm not sad you're about to die." I fucking love that. Now, Ramona is also pretty bad. You don't see it as much in the movie, but it's more obvious here. Ramona is also cheating, but gets mad at Scott for the same thing. Eventually, she accepts she is bad and is going to try to change, and hell, even Scott realizes he's shitty too, and also decides he needs to change. And the comic ends with Ramona and Scott still together as shitty people, but going to give it another try and attempt to be better people. Do they succeed? Who knows? But I believe people can change, and I like this ending better than the movie version. However, in my opinion, I think Ramona and Kim should have been together instead. Not just because they have more chemistry and both have an interest in each other, but I just think they're a cuter couple than her and Scott, and I think Scott should probably learn some self-respect and responsibility before he's ready for a relationship. But oh well. Anyway, I think the comic's pretty good.